This video today is going to show you how to make scones or scones, whichever way you prefer to pronounce it. I usually tend to go between the two and call it both in some way or another, but I said it's entirely up to you. Either way is the correct way of saying it. So what I've done before I get started, I've got my flour ready, my sugar, my margarine, my milk measured out, and I've also ready greased my baking tray. So the first thing that you need to do is add your margarine to the flour. Now we're using self-raising flour here because we want our scones to rise. If I was making short crust pastry, I would use plain flour because we wouldn't want that to rise. If I was making bread, we would be using strong flour because that gives a much stronger rise when we're actually using yeast with it. But for the purpose of scones, we can use self-raising flour because we just want there to be a bit of a rise and there's not so much structure to hold together. So I've added my margarine. And the first thing I'm going to do before I start rubbing that in is just coat it in flour. That just makes it a little bit less messy. And I'm going to cut it up into smaller pieces. And then I'm going to also coat those with flour. Again, it just means it doesn't get quite so messy on your hands. So I've cut those up. Just going to roll them around in the flour. And then we're going to start what is known as the rubbing in process. So you basically pick up the flour and the margarine together and just rub them between your fingertips. Now we're not doing that in the bowl like this, we're actually lifting it up out of the bowl because we want it to mix right the way through. We need to make sure as well that we're scooping the flour up from the bottom of the bowl, so again we're not just rubbing it into the flour on the top. Now what we're doing here is coating the flour particles in fat in the margarine, so it means it limits how much of the liquid they absorb when we add liquid to the mixture, and that again helps then with the texture of the product. So we just need to get all of that mixed in. Now the best way to check that you've mixed all this in, and I know I haven't mixed all that in correctly, but it will demonstrate to you, if you shake your bowl from side to side, any lumps of margarine that are left in there will come up to the top, and you know that you need to carry on rubbing those in. Now this process, rubbing in method, is the same process as we use when we're making short crust pastry, when we are making shortbread, okay, now when we're making crumble. So the process is exactly the same. The outcome is slightly different though. Given the amount of fat we use into flour, we would expect this to be more breadcrumby like. When we make crumble, we use half the amount of fat to flour, so a much higher percentage of fat is used in that, and that then gives us the bigger bits of crumble, which is what we would obviously want with a crumble. Okay, with this we're just looking to actually rub it in, so it doesn't really look that much different to what it looked like as flour. So again, just shaking the bowl, checking. Those are just bits where my hands have stuck them together, so we're ready now to go on to the next stage. So I'm just going to add some sugar to this. You may decide that you want to add some fruit. You could use some currants, some sultanas, some glacé cherries, some coconut, lots of options, some dried mango, dried apple pieces, or you may want to even put some fresh fruit in here. Or you may decide that you want to go savoury and you want to add some cheese, in which case you would add the cheese at this stage along with any, and also if you're doing fruit ones and you wanted any fruit in there. So those would also go in, but if you were doing the savoury ones, doing the cheese ones, then obviously you wouldn't add the sugar. So the next thing we're going to do now is start adding the milk. Now you probably won't need to have all of the milk. Okay, we'll see how we go now. So we know we're going to need most of it. So we can tip most of the milk in to start, but I'm not, as you can see, it's not so easy to see, I know on the camera, but I'm not putting all of it in at this stage. And then using a knife, you could use a wooden spoon. I prefer a knife because it just actually, in my opinion, cuts through the mixture better. So I'm just using a knife there and really mixing it around the bowl to try and get it to form a dough. Now you could, if you wanted to, also use some wholemeal flour in place of some of the white flour, and that would add more fibre to your scones. You can see in the bowl there, I'm sure, we've just got a little bit there that hasn't stuck together. So I'm just going to add a little bit more milk, and I literally mean a little bit more milk. And that is now bringing the dough together how I want it to be. So we don't need to add any more of the milk once we get to that stage. If you do go beyond that stage and you add too much milk and it ends up looking more like a porridge mixture, you just need to, obviously don't add any more milk, and just add some flour into it until it comes together to this sort of consistency. Now just to show you, I have still got quite a bit of the milk there. Now it depends, different flours will actually soak up different amounts of milk depending on what you're using in there. If I was putting cheese in here, I would probably have needed a bit more of the milk, and some of the fruits do tend to bulk it out a bit. So there's no right or wrong amount, you just add the milk until it comes together as a dough. So once you've got your dough, okay, we've got a nice dough there, we need to put it onto a floured surface. So I'm just going to pop some flour down here now. Don't go overboard with the flour because we don't want to dry that out. So just put your dough on there, and we're going to knead that lightly just to make sure that it's all come together properly, and to just make sure everything is mixed through finally. Now some people like to use rolling pins to roll this out. Again, personal choice, I prefer not to use a rolling pin. I tend to find when people use rolling pins, they do them far too thin, and scones should be nice and thick so that we can cut them and put filling in the middle of them if we wanted to, or just cut them and actually butter them. So that's going to be ready to go now. So just making sure, I haven't got that, it's very smooth there on the top side, so I'll keep going again a minute. There we go, that's better. Alright, so I'm going to pat that out with my hand. Just checking again that I've got enough flour underneath. I don't want it to stick. I do tend to use too much flour, and now I've gone a bit the other way. So I'm going to pat that out with my hand. Okay, we're not patting it out too much, and again, if I can try and show you on here, we're looking at it being a couple of centimetres thick, because as I said, we do want a nice rise on them. So I'm going to cut them out. Now you've got two different types of cutters. We've got the plain one and we've got the fluted one. Traditionally the fluted one would be used for sweet scones, so I would use it for this. I actually prefer the appearance of them with using the smooth cutters, so I'm going to use the smooth cutter for this. But again, if you wanted traditional, you could use a fluted one, or as I said, whichever really you prefer. If you don't have cutters at home, but you've got any small glass, you can just use the bottle, or turn it upside down obviously, and cut through using that, so you don't have to necessarily have cutters at home. Now what I recommend you do is get as many as you can cut out in the first go, because once we put it back together, and I will show you once the scones are cooked, they don't tend to rise in the same way. So get your cutter as close to the edge and as close to the previous one that you've cut out as possible, so that we are not having to keep re-rolling this dough any more than we need to. So I'm going to pop those onto the baking tray, and then I'm going to put this dough back together and pat it out again. Okay, and I will show you in a moment as well that we don't need to have any wastage when we're doing these. So put that back together, pat it back out. I don't think I'm going to get too out of this one. I've done those quite thick. So get another one cut out there. And see if we get another one out of this, otherwise I'll show you what we do when we've got a bit left over. Okay, so we've got another one cut out there. And then what we do with the odd bit that we got left, you can just actually roll that up and shape it and just actually put that on as a smaller one. It doesn't need to go to waste. So I've got my scones on my tray. I've placed them on the tray now so that it actually puts them in a position so that the heat can circulate around them. They're not going to spread, they are only going to rise upwards, but it just is better that the heat can actually get between all of those. Okay, just something else worth mentioning. You could, if you wanted to at this stage, brush the top of your scones with a bit of milk or with a beaten egg, which would give it a more glazed finish. Again, personally, I'm quite happy with the appearance of these without putting anything on the top, and you can judge for yourselves when you actually see them when they've come out of the oven. So I will show you what they look like. But as I said, out of this size mixture, I've got 6 nice sized scones and then a small piece which has just been left over, which again, as I said, saves wasting it. So I'm going to pop those into the oven. The oven's on gas mark 6, which is 200 degrees, and they will take about 10 to 12 minutes to cook. Okay, so the scones are cooked. As I said to you, I didn't want anything on the top of them. I'm quite happy with the finish that we've actually got on those. But as I said, if you wanted a more glazed finish, then you could put some beaten egg or some milk on there. They've risen really nicely. Okay, certainly enough there for them to actually be cut and filled. Now, if you did fruit scones, you may just want to fill them, cut them and butter them. You may want to actually be a little bit more adventurous with what you're doing, and if you've got plain scones here like myself, I'm going to fill these later, I should say, with some fresh cream and some jam. But I'm going to leave them on the cooling rack first of all to cool down before I go on to that stage, which I'm not going to show you because that's certainly not something that you need to be doing. So your scones are done, and hopefully you will enjoy doing this practical as well.